Welcome back. Well, today I want to talk about a gun that I really enjoy using. It's fascinating to me, and it's very fascinating to many collectors and aficionados, and it's really not a rifle, it's a carbine. It's the .30 US M1 Carbine. And I enjoy this particular rifle so much that I've got two of them. I've got this one here, and I've also got another slightly different configuration that I'll talk about right here. Now, I'm not going to rehash the history of this fine carbine that has been gone into quite capably by quite a number of YouTubers. It has a complex history of manufacture that is probably unlike most other military firearms. But what I want to do is basically talk a little bit about the practical aspects of the gun. It's what has kept it so popular through the years, and why it has fascinated American shooters and people from all around the world for so long. When I say around the world, you know, this is a rifle in the last 80 years has been issued to not only our military, but has been issued to military and police and security troops all over the planet. Its conception was very much a spur-of-the-moment thing. When it was decided in 1939 that we needed to have something to fill that bill, to have a lightweight, compact fighting firearm, it was also determined that the gun needed to be something more than the .45 auto the 1911 was able to do in World War I, which was basically to really give capable fighting support to somebody in the rear echelon, or for a truck driver, a mortar crew, somebody who was in a tank or anything like that. Somebody who couldn't handle a full-size rifle and certainly didn't need to have a full-size rifle at their disposal. But they needed to have something that was fast and handy and could certainly offer devastating support fire, but without being unwieldy. Now, so successful was the .30 US Carbine that it was manufactured. There was over 6.1 million of these made, which exceeded the Garand by nearly 1 million, if I'm not mistaken. So it was a tremendous production effort in a period of time that was very, very short. It spanned a period from only 1942 until early 1945, when its production was ceased. Now, it was manufactured by over 10 different contractors, and the contractors that came into play did not necessarily, most of them had nothing to do, they had no former experience making firearms. This particular gun here, both of these happen to be made by IBM. IBM is a computer company today, and we know them as making the Selectric typewriter through a period of decades. They were a business machine company. They were made by Rockola, which was a jukebox company that made music jukeboxes. They were made by Inland. Inland made the largest number of them. That was a division of General Motors. And Saginaw Steering, another division of General Motors, made them. They were made by 10 different manufacturers, all under contract to make a specific design that was so compatible that any number of those parts could be swapped from one company's rifle to another. It didn't make any difference. You know, the wide diversity of modifications that were made in that short period of time are many, and those who are familiar with the history of this gun know that well. It's a gun that has had many, many different changes, and I'll talk a little bit about some of those changes without going into the great detail that some people can go into. But The gun was designed to be handy, which it is, to be lightweight, which it is. This is barely over 5 pounds unloaded, and its overall length is very, very compact. Its design is such that the sling is mounted not on a sling swivel on the front, but it's loaded. The sling is actually hung from an oiling bottle, which is on the rear of the stock here, and there's a practical reason for that. This carbine will lay flat against the back of a person rather than jutting into his rib cage as he's hanging it on him, because this carbine was designed to be hung on your back. Having said all that, it served very, very, very well in combat. It has a notable history of battle success. You know, it's not, despite the fact that it's a diminutive cartridge, we have a cartridge here that's, the .30 carbine is little more than a lengthened handgun cartridge that headspace is on the end of the case, and it's a rimless design. And when compared to the .30-06 of its day, of the same caliber, .30 caliber, you can see how much smaller it is. Now, the .30-06 was naturally that was the standard issue battle cartridge of the day for the M1 Garand, and previously had been used in the 1903 Springfield and in the Enfield. So it was not designed to compete on a shoulder-to-shoulder basis with such a powerhouse as the .30-06. It was, however, designed and conceived to be a cartridge which would be capable of combat in a close-range combat situation of up to 300 yards. It was actually, that was the demand of the government, was to have a cartridge that would be able to sustain fire up to relatively competent fire up to 300 yards in a combat situation. And that's exactly what it does, and that's exactly what it was capable of doing. Oh, look who just came in the room. Come over here. This is my goddaughter, and this is her sister. So I just love to have these guys around. They're staying with us for a little while. So, all right, ladies, go upstairs. And Benny's been enjoying their company. Have you been enjoying Benny's company? Yeah, I guess they have. So, that little, don't break anything on the way up now. So, I love them. So where was I? So the gun served itself very, very well, not only through World War II in combat. It actually found itself in serious combat in many situations. You know, this was not just a support firearm, as it turned out to be. That was its original conception, was to be a support firearm. But in many cases, this turned out to be an A #1 rifle in the combat field. It had its variant was with a folding stock was used by paratroopers of the day, especially those who dropped into St. Mary Glace before Normandy and a number of other situations. It found itself landing on beaches, and there's certain reasons why it turned out to be such a very, very desirable combat piece that I'll talk about also. Let me just go over a little bit about why it was engineered the way it was. I told you that it was desired to have a lightweight, short, compact firearm, but it was also desired to have something that could be very, very rapidly manufactured and put into service, which it was, up to over 6.1 million of them, if you can imagine, in that short span of time. It didn't exist before 1941. It was very hastily conceived, but it was remarkably well designed. Now you hear about, I'm sure you've heard about Carbine Williams, who was an individual who he was certainly a very talented gun designer, and he had a somewhat unusual history where he was imprisoned as a felon for murder, and he had been a bootlegger early on in the 20th century. But he had a talent for designing guns, and sometimes too much credit has been given to him for his partnership in the M1 Carbine's design. His most notable contribution was the short stroke gas tappet system, which is the driving force of this gun. Rather than the long stroke version of gas operation, which was used in the M1 Garand, this uses a very efficient tappet that is on the gas, under the gas port, which it basically just flicks the bolt back with great inertia, and thrusts that bolt back very capably. And that also brought into being the first military use of non-corrosive ammunition. Non-corrosive ammunition was absolutely necessary for this design, because that tappet system would quickly get clogged up and become, and the carbine would become totally worthless once it was clogged up with the residue which is left by corrosive primers. So non-corrosive primers were first initiated with this particular firearm, and it was a great success. The cartridge, the cartridge is, as I say, it's not a powerhouse by any means. At only 1,980 feet per second, it's a very, even in its day, was considered to be a very lightweight in the arena. But it has it had the ability to do the job. It had the ability to put the enemy down, and without necessarily brute force, but it was fast handling, it was quick shooting. A lot of guys preferred this gun simply because they, in the jobs that they were given, they could handle this gun, and it didn't get in the way. Why? Sometimes some people wonder, why in the world did they employ Walnut on such guns such as the M1 Carbine and the Garand, and certainly other military firearms around the world. But black walnut was at the time the wood of choice for the military, and it was not because it was a pretty wood necessarily. And walnut is a very pretty wood, but it has very practical qualities for a firearm. When the military says that we want to have a carbine that weighs 5 pounds, they don't mean nominally 5 pounds. They want to have every one that comes off the line weighing the exact same thing. One of the great properties about walnut is that its density is very uniform from tree to tree. It's a 38 pound per cubic foot wood, and it doesn't vary like some woods from 36 to 42 or something like that. So every rifle or carbine built, it can be assured that it's going to fall within the specifications of weight. One of the other fascinating qualities about walnut is that it has a very dense grain, and being a very dense, fine grain, it machines very nicely. The the ability for a gun to be produced in rapid succession in the hustle of such a formidable manufacturing project requires that there be very, very little waste. Walnut is one of those woods that, when used in the manufacture of firearms, has got almost a 0% waste factor. It's not prone to splitting during manufacture. It's not prone to burring up when it's being milled, and fine, intricate recesses are being cut out of the stock. It's a wood that can be counted on to machine almost like steel. Very, very, very precision machining. And it's also, it has the density that can be used in a combat situation for, literally to give somebody a butt stroke, or to support the use of a bayonet in combat. It's a very good wood that way. And it's also a wood which is very, very resistant to warpage. You hear a lot about, how gun stocks warp, when you subject them to moisture and things like that. Well, when you're talking about free-floated stocks where the wood can move, a 1/16 of an inch and bear on the barrel and throw its accuracy off, that's true. But we're talking about sporting firearm accuracy. For military firearms, when we're talking about a weapon that has to maintain a 4-minute of angle accuracy standard, Walnut is very, very stable in that regard, and its movement is very, very slight, and it's very predictable. Everybody who manufactures these guns know how much that wood's going to move in a worst case situation. It also has a grain which readily takes up linseed oil. And now linseed oil was the only finish that was ever applied to these carbines throughout the war, and also for the M1 Garand. And it gives it a fabulous luster, just because and linseed oil is a good preservative that keeps the wood in good shape through the years. These were saturated in vats of linseed oil for a number of hours, and which literally soaked the wood through. And it provided excellent protection. And linseed oil, being what it is, it dries to a hard finish, and it can also it can be repeated. So, soldiers were very frequently back in the barracks. They'd be issued a can of linseed oil that they passed around, and they would, when they cleaned their guns, they'd also give them another wipe down of linseed oil and rub it in, which helped maintain that finish. Now, that's a very practical aspect. The gun was also conceived to have a bolt, which is in many ways reminiscent of, it's designed with a rotating bolt, which is not unlike the Garand. But that's its only real similarity. The only actual part that's interchangeable from one to another is actually the screw that holds the butt plate on. This screw is the same dimension as a M1 Garand screw. Other than that, there's no similarity between the two guns, other than the fact that they have a rotating bolt with a toggle on the side, on the op rod. And they're also 30 caliber 308 diameter bore. But that's it. It's a very, very lightweight rifle, and the cartridge itself is it's a blast to shoot. Literally, I mean, it's a fun cartridge to shoot. Every time I've ever watched somebody shoot these for the first time, they just light up and they say, "Wow, that's fun!" I think it's actually one of the most fun guns that anybody can shoot, and that's one of its great attractions and appeals through the years. There were a number of various forms that this gun took through the years, and although every one of them are interchangeable, all the parts through the years are all interchangeable. You can basically tear this gun down and swap the parts in a basket and put it back together and make another rifle, and it's not going to make any difference because they were made to that particular standard. All the different manufacturers, out of the 10 manufacturers, they all produced the same gun. Many different forms of the same gun, many different forms of parts and variations that were made through the years. And I'll just go over some of those right here. This one here, these are both IBMs, and these both have 15 round magazines, and the 15 round magazine, it has eventually evolved into other magazines. We have 10 round magazines that are available commercially now for those that need it. And there's also 30 round magazines and things, but the 15 round magazine was commonplace in World War II. The magazine is probably its weak point. It was conceived probably as a throwaway. Quite often, these magazines were simply tossed in combat, and another one was replaced to put in the gun. So they weren't necessarily designed to give long-lasting results, but they worked. It has this oiler here, and it's actually functional. It's got a little cover on it, and you can fill it with it's probably less than a thimbleful of oil, but it's certainly more than enough to keep this gun in operating condition. And it's this one here, this IBM, and they're both IBMs. This IBM here has got the original configuration that came out of all the different factories without the bayonet lug. It had different style bands. It had two different style bands through the years before it came out with before Springfield Armory started producing the bayonet lug. The front sight is a protected wing front sight. It's a simple post, Cartridge style post. The handguard top was variously manufactured with a narrower and a wider configuration slot here for sighting. This one here has two rivets that hold together the sheet metal support that goes against the receiver. Later on, that was strengthened by adding another two rivets. It's a very simply designed mechanism. Carbine Williams designed that gas tappet system, which is very successful. It works very well, and it's got this one here happened to be an earlier configuration. You can see it has that flat machined bolt, and as years went on, it turned into, as production went on, they realized that was a cosmetic feature they didn't need to spend time on in the hurry to make these. So that machining aspect was left out, and it retained just a round design bolt. This is a later production, which is a Parkerized. This has a Parkerized bolt. It's also an IBM. This one here has a machined rear sight. This rear sight is adjustable. That was not the original configuration. It originally had a flip-up rear sight that was short range, close range, and 300 yards. That was later on changed to be this adjustable sight, and that was made by different contractors. The sight basically can be adjusted from 100 yards by simply sliding it back with your finger. You can click it into different yardages from 200 to 250 and 300 yards by simply clicking. And you can do that. You can do that basically by just feel. By braille method. So you can just click those into place as you wish, and it's adjustable for windage. The original flip-up sight had to be driven basically driven with a hammer from one side to the other to adjust its windage. So they typically have very reliable accuracy. They're not a super accurate rifle per se, but they have very reliable accuracy. Most of them do quite well. They're fun to shoot. They generally hit what you're aiming at, and they are indeed a very fun gun to shoot. The cartridge is not a, as I say, it's not a beast. It's enough. It provided more. It certainly provided more knockdown power than a .45 auto pistol, primarily because most people, virtually everybody, could hit what they're shooting at, whereas the 1911 was something which most people have a lot of difficulty with unless they spend years practicing with it. In this initial configuration, bluing was, whereas the other one was parkerized. The earlier versions were blued, and bluing being what it is, and parkerizing being what it is. The parkerizing is a little bit longer lasting in a combat environment where care is not necessarily something that can be given daily. A notable change, which neither of these guns have, is that this crossbolt safety right here, it was found in early years of use, in early service, that crossbolt safety sometimes was mistaken for the magazine release, and somebody would push the wrong button and they'd either be dropping their magazine out or think they had their safety on when in fact they didn't. So that was changed to a toggle switch, which replaced that crossbolt. So that was another very, I would say one of the more serious changes through the years. And as I said, the incorporation of the bayonet lug was a latter-day improvement. That they were manufactured by Springfield Armory, and they basically just simply replaced the front barrel band. The sling is a simple 1-inch sling. This is a sling. This is not a shooter's sling like I've spoken about with the Garand rifle. In a second, I'll take this gun down and I'll show you some of the innards of it. One of the things that's kind of fascinating, every single one of these carbines through the years, despite their many changes, the one thing that stayed constant through the years was that this takedown screw here in the barrel band was always configured to have, I don't know if you can pick that up, but the slotted portion is dished, and that actually fits. That's actually made so that a carbine case, a 30 M1 carbine case, can, without a screwdriver being handy, that can be used to turn that screw. And it's also made so that you can finish turning it with your fingers because it's contoured on the side. So it was made to be very, very practical in the field, in a combat environment. It did very, very well. History shows that not only did it serve U.S. troops in World War II and throughout Korea, it actually served as a primary arm for many people. And those who were in deep combat, those people who actually were not just necessarily rear echelon people or people who were in operating other implements of war, but it actually served in many cases as a primary fighting arm, and it did very, very well despite its detractors. There are stories that emerged in the fog of war. There's always stories that come up, and there's no way to verify. You can't prove a negative, but it was certainly felt that in Korea especially, that its firepower was seriously lacking. There were anecdotal stories of people who had witnessed they say they witnessed the bullets bouncing off frozen North Korean and Chinese garments. Well, you know, tests in modern times have shown that the .30 carbine cartridge with its 110 grains, this has a 110 grain, virtually round nose projectile. It's got somewhat of a pointed profile, but it's essentially it's called a round nose projectile, and it's 110 grains. So it's a lightweight bullet for its caliber. It has very little sectional density, but despite the fact that it has little sectional density and little energy, it's doubtful that within standard combat ranges that it actually bounced off anybody's frozen clothing. So be that as it may, it probably was oftentimes used at ranges that exceeded its capabilities. But certainly within standard combat ranges up to 100, 200 yards, it was something to be reckoned with. Nobody's going to stand there and take these bullets without feeling the impact. And it was some of the things were very desirable. The very fact that this gun used non-corrosive ammo was a very desirable thing in the Pacific Theater, where fighters were dealing constantly with jungle corrosion. You know, a lot of moisture in the jungles that sometimes the Garand had a difficult time with corrosion because it was already a corrosive cartridge to begin with, and top that with the moisture, and serious corrosion quickly ensued. So this gun, in many cases, was more desirable in such an environment. It proved itself very capably in that regard. It was found certainly in the jungle, and not only the jungle in the Pacific Theater of World War II, but also found in Southeast Asia during Vietnam, the early years of Vietnam, that its capability of being able to get through brush was sorely lacking. You know, we're talking about heavy nipa palm vegetation, and you know, where combat ranges in the jungle sometimes were no more than 10 or 15 yards away, but even then, sometimes a palm tree could stop this very easily, and it didn't have to be a very big palm tree. So it did have its limitations, but despite that, it still served very admirably and capably. So much so that it was highly desired by militaries throughout the world for the last 80 years. I want to take this down a little bit and show you just how simple this gun is. And so I'm gonna grab my screwdriver. I'm not going to try to unwind that screw with just the cartridge because it takes too long. So. Okay, so disassembling this is easy enough that I can do it without my glasses on. I believe so, at least. I'll just unwind this screw here. Now, one of the things I noticed between these two particular carbines is that this earlier version, I can actually take that screw entirely out. Now, I don't know if that's just something that occurred because somebody unscrewed it too far one time, but the threads on the newer one with the bayonet lug actually have a stop on the thread, so I can't take it down beyond that. Now, both of these guns, I mean, these have not been shot for several months, and these have been unloaded and checked and everything before I started. So, but to take us down, basically you unsnap this snap. Now, if you ever have one of these and you wonder why it won't open, you press the dot. Always press the dot as you pull the tab. One of the curiosities of this particular sling, this is a reproduction sling, but they all had this horseshoe pattern right here, the original slings all had this horseshoe pattern, and they all had, many of them said press the dot. So you just press this dot as you pull it, and it just pops off very easily. But if you try to yank it, sometimes, you know, it'll defy you. So it was designed to push, and that was basically to prevent unintentional unsnapping in a field situation. So once you've got that undone, now if you want, you can take the sling off the oiler, and I'm not going to do that because that's something. That's an entire Magilla of its own. But now all you simply do is depress this catch in the front here, the spring-loaded catch, and push the band forward and slide it forward. Now these bands, another thing which is sometimes not mentioned, is that these bands were designed so that they're captured by this front sight, so they can't be lost in the field, which is a very handy thing. And there's your handguard, the top handguard. There's that piece of sheet metal I was talking about, that steel retainer, and that has the two rivets as opposed to the newer ones which have 4 rivets. And there's the stock. Now the back of the stock right here, this lug right here retains the back of the receiver. The receiver hooks underneath that, and that's retained by a screw which goes through into an escutcheon in the underside where the pistol grip is. So that's a very, very simple mode of dismantling it. This stock had some variations through the years as well. It had a pot belly configuration in later years, where this part of the stock underneath was thicker in dimension, and it actually dropped down a little bit like a pot belly. So, but this one here is the straight configuration that was made early on. And again, this was made by International Business Machines Corporation. One of the fascinating things I think about the IBM, and I just happen to have 2 IBMs because that's just what I happen to have. No other reason in particular. One of the fascinating things about IBM, I think, is that because they came into the project of manufacturing these a little bit later than other manufacturers, their parts tend to be a little bit more uniform, and they didn't farm out as many parts to subcontractors, because there were 10 primary government contractors, but there were many subcontractors that made pins and triggers and you name it throughout the years that they were manufactured. But IBM and its affiliate Auto Ordnance produced most of the parts themselves with very little outsourcing. So they tend to be, in that regard, a little bit cleaner. Now this carbine right here actually is not a correct gun by any means. The receiver is IBM. It's made by Auto Ordnance when they were manufacturing receivers for IBM. Auto Ordnance out of Worcester, Massachusetts. It's the trigger. The trigger mechanism is Winchester. The trigger mechanism is Winchester, and there's other parts which are in this gun which are not by either IBM or Auto Ordnance or Winchester. So this is a mongrel. It's a very fine one, but it's I would say that the quality of this particular gun is as good as it gets. This is really a fine piece. But for collectible reasons, it's not one of the more collectible versions. They're all becoming collectible now. To take it down is simply a matter of pulling on the recoil spring and removing that. And there's this pin right here. Actually, you know, you can use that rod to push out other pins and to use it as leverage to pull back on the trigger components. So once you've got that down, You can simply slide this. You can slide this straight to the rear. But before I do that, I'm going to hammer rearward. It is already cocked. So once it's cocked, I can make sure that the safety is in the on position so that it doesn't accidentally fire. And I can remove this forward pin. That pin is actually removed by just tipping it out in most cases. Hi, Benny. Here's my boy. Yeah, he's here. You get those girls making you play too hard, huh? Yeah. So you can use that to push that pin out sideways, but there's no force involved in pushing that pin out. And once you have that, then the trigger mechanism, the trigger group, just slides straight to the rear out of this dovetail back here and lifts out of place. Now, you can take down this trigger assembly very, very simply. It doesn't, for those in the field, they were certainly not authorized to take it down beyond this for simple cleaning. But as you can see, this is one of the most simple mechanisms that you've ever seen in a firearm, and it was therefore very, very easy to clean in the field. A simple dunk in a bucket of kerosene, and that would come out shining clean with very little brushing. Now, there's some similarities here in the manufacture of this particular op rod and how it connects with the bolt. And as I slide this back, what's done is on the underside of this barrel, you can see this notch right here. That interfaces with a notch on the operating rod, and that just simply drops down. So, and I'm also trying to do it without my glasses on, but that's how that comes off. Don't be surprised if I've edited a few seconds out of that. But this rear surface back here is the surface that interfaces with the short stroke piston. Now, the short stroke piston that was designed by Williams is this piston right here. Now, this is a tappet really, and this tappet has a very slight amount of movement, but it just basically jerks backwards on firing. The small amount of gas whacks into that, pushes that tappet back, and the tappet throws the bolt back. So it's a very simple operation that works very well for a relatively low intensity cartridges, the 30 M1 Carbine. It wouldn't work with larger cartridges that require more gas moderation than that. Even the Mini 14 has got to have an open gas system. Let me talk a little bit about that aspect of the M1 Carbine. The M1 Carbine was, Bill Ruger borrowed heavily from it when he designed the Mini 14. I mean, the design similarities are very, very obvious. Although the gas system is certainly a different configuration, he borrowed heavily from it in terms of the bolt design. The bolt is the same type of Garand styling, and the way I did that was basically just sliding, just like with a Mini 14, just slide the bolt back, tip it up at a 45-degree angle, and just rotate it, pop it out. The configuration of the extractor and ejector is commonplace in the Mini 14, as is the op rod interaction with interface with the bolt. Just the design, the overall design of the gun, its aesthetics, and aesthetics plays very, very strongly in all firearms. Manufacturers know that from the get-go, and it wasn't long after World War II that a lot of designers realized that the popularity of the M1 Carbine meant that maybe it was going to be something that's a design that was going to fare well in the marketplace. So, different manufacturers have made 22s and other firearms which have had that had a lot of its essential design aesthetics. Probably the most famous one of all is the Ruger 1022. The Ruger 1022 was, that was, if you compare a Ruger 1022 side by side with the M1 Carbine, they're certainly not the same mechanism by any stretch of the imagination, but that essential aesthetic appearance, that look, the configuration of the stock, the forward barrel band, its basic looks from the side and everything, its handling qualities are very popular. And that's one of the reasons why when somebody picks up an M1 Carbine for the first time, they're just as delighted to shoot it as they are with a 1022. So that's this particular gun right here. And as I said, this is the part that's all IBM, the receiver and the barrel. And this one here happens to be an import that was brought back into the country. So this one here had to be basically it had to re-enter the land where it originally came from as an import. But this was originally certainly manufactured by entirely U.S. Production. And this one here happens to have, as I say, AO on the receiver, and that was manufactured by Auto Ordnance in the early years of the relationship between IBM and Auto Ordnance, which was not so with the manufacturer of this particular gun right here. This carbine right here does not have AO on the receiver. It's very difficult to actually see the IBM stamp roll mark on the back of this receiver because it's so well hidden by these sights. But believe me, it's there. I've been able to see it with a magnifying glass and strong light. But this gun is 100% correct. Everything about this particular carbine is IBM or Auto Ordnance all the way. And with very, very few parts, the only parts that don't fall into that category are those parts which were normally farmed out by IBM anyway. So that's it. It's a fascinating gun historically. It's a fascinating gun to shoot. It's a lot of fun to shoot. But let me say one thing about this. And now I've heard a lot of tales, and I've read a lot of things about this gun being used for hunting. Trust me when I say that this, and also to follow the advice of all the reloading manufacturers, all the loading manual writers. They've all been very consistent through the years, whether it's Lyman or Hornady or whatever. They all recommend that this gun be used for what it is capable of doing in civilian terms. It's for self-defense, for plinking, and for small game. This is not a game rifle. This is not a large game rifle by any means. It's a very, very puny cartridge when it comes to taking down large game. If you compare even a 30-30, which is considered by many people to be the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to being a deer cartridge, you're talking about a 170 grain, 150 or 170 grain bullet, which is going in excess of 2,100 feet per second out of a 20-inch barrel. And this is only a 110 grain bullet, which is going at 2,000 feet per second at best. So it's not a hunting cartridge for game. And it's probably not a practical small game cartridge because, you hit a rabbit with a 110 grain bullet at that speed and you're doing a lot of damage to your dinner. So, but it's a lot of gun. It's a lot of gun for self-defense. It's certainly a lot of gun for having fun. And it's a lot of gun for the collector. This is probably one of the most collectible firearms in American history. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and God bless.